I'd like to welcome you today to the podcast In the Pursuit of Hoppiness. As I mentioned in the introductory video, this will be a webcast that will cover a variety of topics all based around beer and homebrewing. You may wonder why I'm enjoying my beer today out of a bowl, of all things, a straw. Both vessels and means of consumption that are not seen as normal for drinking beer. Which brings us to today's topic. I decided, since this is the first official main video of this series, I may as well start at the beginning, and let's go back and take a look at a little bit of history of homebrewing, or at least beer itself. From a little bit of reading I did, it appears that the first fermented beverage that has at least ancestry or roots tied to beer was fermented by the Chinese roughly 12,000 years ago. The ingredients are not what we'd consider beer ingredients by today's, but back then this was a beverage that consisted of rice, honey, and fruits that were fermented and then, of course, became alcoholic and enjoyed. If we fast forward a little bit, the first grain-based beers were thought to have come from a region of Mesopotamia in either Iran or Iraq. I've read both, and were brewed by the Sumerians. These typically would still not be recognized as what you and I would expect to be a beer today. While made from grain, they were much thicker. I read the description almost gruel-like compared to what we drink. I kind of like to think of watery oatmeal that's been left to ferment. And actually, when thinking of ideas for this video, I half tempted to leave my oatmeal sitting out and consume that, but I figure that might be a bad idea. The key points to take from what the Sumerians did, and the reason why I'm drinking my beer from a straw, was that it was a mixture of water and grains, and typically they'd mix some herbs and spices in with it to give a pleasant taste and aid in the stability of the final product. To help separate out some of the sludge and chunks of herbs that they mix in this concoction of theirs, they actually were credited as developing some of the first straws specifically to help drink their beer out of bowls. By doing so, they could siphon off the good stuff off the top and leave all the sludge sitting in the bottom. From this region, beer traveled kind of outwards from this central region, and the Egyptians were known to have brewed beer. In fact, both them and the Sumerians used beer as a form of currency to pay wages for a lot of their laborers. The Egyptians especially were known to have given out a beer ration 3 times a day in exchange for labor. Going forward a little bit further, beer migrated out of this region, kind of up further north and outwards. It is interesting to note that both the Greek and the Romans didn't think a whole lot of beer. Beer was considered a barbaric, almost working class beverage, not something that the high society drank. This was reserved for strong wine. In fact, much of the literature of the time refers to wine as a noble drink and looks rather poorly upon beer. I have to wonder a little bit if that's a direct link to even today how beer is considered more of a working class beverage and wine still is seen as more of a high society type of drink. I don't think it deserves such. Once you've spent any time brewing or really getting into beer, there are as many, if not more, varieties of beer, and the process to actually brew a beer is every bit of it or can be every bit as intricate as that of making wine. But that is just this one person's opinion. We go forward to the Middle Ages. Beer throughout much of Europe was a family tradition in industry. It was seen as a way of keeping the water that you drank healthier. A lot of water supplies at that time were not the most sanitary. Although I did read one source that commented that unlike a lot of popular lore, there was not more beer drank than water. Some of the other advantages of beer at the time was there was a nutritional benefit to it. You know, certain caloric intake for drinking beer, and it lasted longer than if you just left something like bread around. It didn't have a tendency of molding as rapidly. Around 900, the first use of hops is believed to occur once again in Europe. Hops soon came to replace this random mix of herbs like I mentioned before. Hops have a benefit of being antiseptic, and they help produce some preservative effects to the flavor of the beer and how long the beer can be kept. So it soon grew in popularity. Once we get past this, a major shift happened in the middle of the Middle Ages, roughly the 1500s. Beer went from being a cottage family industry to a larger deal. The monks became practitioners of beer brewing along with a local pub, and so as such beer was made in quantity versus what a small family could drink. The early 1500s, I've got written down here, 1516 in Bavaria, important law was passed dictating what could be considered beer. This law was called Reinheitsgebot. And I apologize if I got the pronunciation wrong, but I don't speak German. And this law dictated that there were only 3 things that could go into beer and still be called beer. The first of which was water, which makes sense. The second was barley, and the third was hops. Anything that contained something other than that was not technically considered to be beer. The interesting thing about this law is it actually remained in effect in German production culture all the way until the mid-1980s, before it was revised, allowing things other than those 3 ingredients to be included in what's considered beer. It's kind of funny to think that following those strictly, things like a Hefeweizen with wheat would not be technically considered a beer. And also, if you look at some of the things we can do in home brewing to make interesting flavors, much like the grapefruit IPA I had in the first video, would not technically be considered beer. That kind of puts us up into modern times, modern being a relative, but at least the 1900s. Beer takes a series of quick turns as you get through the Prohibition, and here in the U.S. what we consider big beer and so forth. I'm not going to get into that into this video, but I think we're getting up close to the 5-minute mark, and I think that's enough for one session. Please subscribe to the channel if you find this interesting. I promise you I'll get a little smoother, a little more comfortable as I do a few more of these videos. But once again, enjoy a beer. Cheers, and hopefully next week I will not be drinking beer through a straw.